Even though we've resumed meeting in our churches, I've decided to continue to record my talks just so that you understand this is a pre-recording of the talk that I plan to give this Sunday on August 23rd. I'm going to be beginning a look through Peter's first epistle, the first what's known as First Peter. And I'm entitling this talk Chosen Rejects. That's an oxymoronic title, deliberately chosen, and hopefully it makes sense by the time I'm finished. Now, the world in which we live can be a hostile place. One of the common evidences of the hostility within our world is racial inequality. Now, I didn't understand that I was a beneficiary of white privilege until I heard this definition. White privilege doesn't mean that as a white person, I won't experience problems in life, but it does mean that my problems won't be a result of my skin color. I have to confess that definition applies to me. I don't know what it's like to have a store security person follow me, even though I know people of color for whom it's a common experience. I don't know what it's like to be targeted at an international border crossing because of my skin color, but I've observed it happening to others. I've never worried that my skin color might influence a job application. I've not been afraid to enter a restaurant because of my skin color. While people of color know that the world can be a hostile place, they're not the only ones. People with physical disabilities experience the hostility of being unable to access buildings. Statistics tell us that half the population experiences mental health challenges at some point in their lives. But we do our best to hide those challenges because we are afraid of hostile reactions. For those of us who don't relate to those overt kind of hostilities, maybe our recent experiences with COVID can help us. Unlike hostilities that are only felt by defined groups, the COVID pandemic has universally made us all experience hostility within our world. Now, whether we agree or disagree with the restrictions that have been put in place due to COVID, we can't simply wish the implied hostility of those restrictions away. We all wonder if schools, shopping centers, healthcare facilities, sporting events, churches, vacations, and on will ever feel the same again. Here's a suggestion. When we encounter the hostility of our COVID-restricted world, we would do well to use that as a reminder of people who are confronted by a hostile world every day of their lives. A significant question out of all of this is, how do we live when we encounter hostility in our world? Fortunately for us, the first epistle or letter of Peter in the Bible was written specifically to people who were living within a hostile environment. In fact, we'll find that First Peter is more understandable if we read it as an answer to the question of how we live within a hostile environment. Right from the beginning of his letter, Peter made it clear that he understood that the people to whom he was writing lived in hostile circumstances. Peter's readers were spread out in various regions of what is today Turkey, but they weren't proper citizens. Depending on the translation you look at, Peter called them strangers, sojourners, or exiles. They were a kind of refugee, and any refugee can testify to the hostility of the world they encounter. There are enough references in Peter's letter to make us conclude that Peter wasn't using those descriptive words of being strangers, sojourners, or exiles. He wasn't using those words in the religious, metaphorical sense of the old hymn which says, This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. Peter was addressing them as literal exiles. For instance, when Peter later in his letter wrote, "I urge you as foreigners and exiles," we get the impression that he was describing their actual life situation. Some of the people to whom he wrote were Jewish exiles fleeing Roman persecution. Others were clearly not Jewish, but were likely from the lowest levels of society, because Christianity has always had particular appeal to the severely downtrodden. It's the kind of appeal that would take root many centuries later among North American slaves. With that background of understanding that the world can be a hostile place, Peter began his letter with these simple words, which we should not rush past. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiles, scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. Grace and peace be yours in abundance. For anyone who feels the threat of hostility, Peter's opening words, to God's elect, take on exceptional meaning. The word elect is an important theological term in the Bible, which simply refers to God choosing people. Think of the significance of being chosen for people facing hostility. Being chosen meant that someone actually wanted them. Particularly when we feel rejected, there's nothing more uplifting than to know that someone welcomes us. The critical nature of being chosen is a stark contrast to what we experience when we're not chosen. It's a painful thing to not be chosen to play with other children. It's painful to not be chosen for entry into an educational program, to not be chosen as a friend, or to not be chosen for a job. To be chosen means that we belong, which is why a primary message of the Bible is that God desires for us to know that we belong. Unfortunately, just because God wants us to know we belong doesn't mean that the world in which we live wants us to belong. In a shocking twist, Peter not only called the people to whom he was writing chosen, but with the very next word, he called them exiles. Chosen exiles. Exiles are the very opposite of those who are chosen, because exiles do not belong. And of course, we all want to belong. I'll never forget the emotion I felt as I saw the maple leaf flag waving above the Canadian border as we returned to Canada after being away for 3 years. I was overwhelmed with a feeling of belonging, knowing that the Canadian border officials couldn't deny my entry, and once in Canada, I couldn't be asked to leave. During the few years of living in Mexico with only a flimsy tourist visa, my overly sensitive nature had given me the uneasy feeling that I could be asked to leave at any moment. And it felt wonderful to return to a country where I belonged. The people to whom Peter wrote did not have that sense of belonging. They were the chosen rejects. The world was a hostile place for them, just as it may at times be for us. For all who know the pain of rejection, these few words of Peter's introduction offer us some initial principles with how to respond when we live in a world that is hostile to us. First of all, we must guard our important allegiances. To put it another way, we can ask, are we remaining loyal to those who have our back. Peter's declaration to his readers that they were God's chosen was a powerful reminder that God's intervention in their lives represented an allegiance that was worth guarding. Even if their world gave cause for uncertainty, they could draw comfort from the certainty of God having chosen them, of knowing that God had their back. The reason we have to be careful about guarding our allegiances is that whenever we encounter hostility, we will tend to question our loyalties. Our immediate temptation when we encounter hostility is to switch allegiances. When life throws us a curveball, our human inclination is to blame our allegiances, and we conclude that we need to make changes. What do? Well, we might switch political parties. We might look for a new church. We might abandon our friends. We might even turn on our family and go in search of new allegiances. The problem is that people get in trouble all the time for choosing the wrong allegiances because those new allegiances end up not having their back. God promises to have our back, especially when the going gets tough. The second principle for living successfully in a hostile world is to hold tightly to our true identity. Peter was careful to remind his readers that they had a special identity through being chosen by God. Holding on to our identity is critical because a hostile world has the intent of stripping us of our identity. According to God's view, Peter's readers were specially chosen, but according to the hostile world in which they lived, they were despised refugee exiles. It's like Dolly Parton's famous song about her coat of many colors that her mother had made for her. She thought she was rich because of her special coat, until she went to school and was made fun of by other children for being poor. We will inevitably be destroyed if we interpret the rejection of a hostile world as meaning that we are worthless. We can only feel worthless if we allow others to decide our identity rather than holding on to what is true of us. A hostile world has the power to determine our identity only if we allow it to. We need to hold tightly to our identity. The third principle is identify our unique purpose for living. Identify our unique purpose for living. Sometimes we approach life as if it were a deck of cards from which we blindly choose a card that represents our life. That's not at all the Bible's view of a successful life. We are not designed to live a random life. An important message of the Bible is that we are all unique creations with unique abilities. God invites us to discover the satisfaction of living out the way we have been designed. Being a farm kid and taking mechanical courses in high school, I regularly heard the admonition to use the right tool for the right job. You can use a screwdriver for a pry bar, but you won't for long, because that's not what it was made for. Part of being able to live successfully when the world becomes a hostile place is knowing that we have a unique contribution to make. Peter telling his readers that they were, and these are his words, chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father through the sanctifying work of the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. That was a fancy theological way of saying that we each have been made with a unique purpose and that God desires to help us live out that purpose. All of us want to know that our lives have been worth And nothing makes our lives worthwhile like knowing that we have lived out the purpose for which we were created. Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, If, echoes some of Peter's sentiment that the world can be a hostile place. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. Peter's admonitions that challenge us to guard our important allegiances, to hold tightly to our true identity, and to identify our unique purpose for living will serve us well whenever we encounter a hostile world.